I'm a big believer is that stay true to who you are and try to work with the assets you have, stretch yourself by learning and experience. But like, I think you have to work with your natural capabilities and tune them. I think any government, any bank, any organization can learn from being more bold and more brave to do these things. But like many people will not execute against it because if you don't have that leadership style, nobody will try it. So profitable that apparently it makes sense to keep these systems running.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Fintech Leaders, coming to you from New York City. I'm your host, Miguel Armaza. I'm a co-founder of Gilgamesh Ventures, a venture capital fund that backs early-stage fintech entrepreneurs. If you enjoyed this conversation, I invite you to leave a review on Apple or Spotify so more people can learn about fintech leaders. In this episode, I sit down with Jouk Pleiter, CEO and founder of Backbase, a global fintech that's modernizing software and infrastructure for banks around the world. Founded in 2003, Backbase was bootstrapped to over 200 million euro in annual revenue until they raised a single private equity round over 120 million euro from Motif Partners in 2022, valuing the company at an impressive 2.5 billion euro. They have now grown to over 300 million in ARR. They work with 150 banks and continue to expand across the world. We discussed bootstrapping the company and why they eventually decided to raise external capital, successful strategies for fintechs trying to sell software to banks, why company leaders should think in 5-year chapters, Amsterdam as a tech and fintech hub, and a lot more. I want to start by hearing a little bit about your story. I would like to hear how you started Backbase bootstrapping the company, right? Was it because you did not have access to capital? Was it because you didn't know venture capital was available? Or was this a very conscious choice?
It was out of necessity, right? So I was really starting another company, but we had a lot of stuff there with venture capital. So it was actually kind of a negative experience. It was really bad. And it was really emotional at the time. I really felt like I cannot control my own future. These customers we have, they are not serviced well. So I decided to kind of go back to basics, that's Backbase, and start a new company. And if you do that, I was kind of deeply motivated to do it without external capital.
And so tell us about the differences between, so obvious differences, you don't have capital. How did you put this into practice to actually get the ball rolling?
Yeah, well, that was very easy because, well, of course, then you take on a stance and you say, I want to do this without it. But then if you take that mental position, then also you are very open to, you would like to kind of find a great idea, you want to find product market fit, but you also realize then like, probably the best thing to do is to go for B2B because then I can also start with a services element. So, and I have to say in the earlier thing, we always kind of separated, let's say, our North Star vision for the products from, let's say, a side hustle where we were doing basically services gigs. And in all fairness, in the first year of Backbase, we were building websites for beer companies where we're doing anything just to kind of get cash flow. And that was totally fine because that cash flow and that kind of margin you generate over there, we could kind of invest that in our mission. So you get a frugality. I knew from previous experiences, you need to separate, let's say, the cash flow stuff, which is maybe tactical. It's not your end game, but you need to get it. And then here in Europe at the time, you were also able to kind of get some innovation grants. So you get very scrappy, you get very creative to find other sources of growth capital. You need to make it, you need to earn it yourself. You need to be a little bit more creative in the grant system. And in those early days, that's what we did. I was very motivated. I didn't see it as a handicap. I just saw it as a game and as a positive thing just to get it going. The only downside is it takes a little bit longer. You cannot kind of immediately go for the dream. You just need to take a couple of extra years to kind of grow into it.
On that point, how, when you got started, what was your plan? How long
Well,
did
yeah,
you?
the original idea behind Backbase, and that's already 20 years ago, it was kind of at that time, basically our original founding idea was a technology idea to modernize the user interface. It's a long time ago, it's 20 years ago, but like at that time, the web browser was like you're reading a comic book, like you're clicking on a link and then would reload a new page. So everything in the page was actually server-side rendered. And then my co-founder at the time, he was our CTO, and he was starting one of those first kind of innovators that was starting to use XML and JavaScript to do a partial page refresh. Now that's commonplace. You go to Gmail, like any app. So I think our original technology vision was perfect, but we very quickly ran into a situation where there were these kind of free open source libraries where that was our commercial product. People were starting to coin this technology Ajax, asynchronous JavaScript and XML detail, but there became many Ajax libraries for free open source. So 3-4 years into the company, and we were already grew the company to 50 people. So it was kind of, you had a lot of responsibilities already at the time for people that put their trust in Backbase. So that was very difficult. It was one of our most difficult moments in time, because how do you compete with free? How do you create a commercial model if you have to compete with open source libraries? So yeah, that was kind of also forcing us to kind of go into basically figuring out how to pivot from competing with open source into something that is more sustainable.
And why financial services?
Well, the story of it's like a little bit like, so quickly in phase one of Backbase was Ajax developer tooling, not a good market. And we moved into what we call a customer experience portal. So we took the core technologies we had, but were able to kind of add additional technologies to it. And then it became more meaningful. It was not just developer tooling, but it was basically a next generation lean portal. And with that portal, we basically said like, hey, the problem many businesses face is that you have information in all sorts of different silos. How do you bring it together in one screen? So that was kind of the next evolution of Backbase, basically the first pivot. And that really kind of put us back on a healthy growth trajectory. You got a healthy license value, etc. But at the time, we were having portal customers in telco, in healthcare, in banking. And we still felt a little bit vulnerable. Like you're still kind of, if you go to a particular industry, your portal is relatively empty. It doesn't really solve the real business process for that particular industry. So we got a feeling like, hey, we need to do one more pivot to really make it hardcore success and kind of real product market fit through that lens. So we decided like we need to probably pick a vertical. And it's a little bit in line with maybe the book Jeffrey Moore, Crossing the Chasm, which I pick your beachhead. Yeah. And I read the book many years before already. I was thinking like, how can I apply this to Backbase? And then it became quite apparent that like picking a vertical would be a great beachhead strategy. And we took our time. It took 2, 3, 4 years to really kind of get conviction that out of all the verticals, the banking one was the most promising one. And I think that had to do with, it's a large industry. The ticket size of the software deals is typically relatively healthy in banking, but also the application itself, like internet banking, it is high frequency and it's high intimacy, right? If you compare that with insurance, how often do you, at the time, you don't really go to an insurance portal, but already at the time, internet banking was very popular. So I think that kind of gave us full conviction. This is now 10 years ago, like 2012, 13, 14, that we really said, okay, let's really go all in on the banking vertical.
And I'm curious, did you have to fire your customers from other verticals?
Well, I don't think we are in a position to fire customers. We were very grateful for the cash flow, but I do realize I was sitting there at the time with our CMO at the time. And I think in 2013, we decided to change our homepage from a customer experience portal into an engagement banking platform. And at that time, still 50% of our revenues were non-banking customers. So that at the time was not firing them, but at least we had to choose color to the market and say like, we're going to go in this direction. And yeah, so you have to show your intent and your direction. And we've been able to service many of these non-banking customers for many years, but over time, they churn and they go in, they take care of their own future.
Yeah. And so maybe share a little bit about building in Amsterdam, in Europe. And I know there are plenty of great companies being started in Europe, plenty of fintechs getting started in Amsterdam. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, Europe has been kind of staying behind if you compare it to the US innovation. So how have you been able to?
I think there's actually major progress in Europe. If you think take things in a historical perspective, I really think like 20 years ago, there was barely no ecosystem. At the time, you had a few companies that were kind of doing some stuff, but maybe in Europe, at least, the Nordics, I think with Skype and a few like, that was way more material. So Holland or Amsterdam was certainly not on the map. And I think that kind of, I see very healthy progress, how that has been developed in the last 10 years. So the ecosystem. So maybe it's by coincidence that we have companies now like Adyen, Backbase, Booking.com, but they kind of all came from that era and they got critical mass, which is great. I think what you also see is that you see a lot of, let's say, international US companies moving to Amsterdam to establish their European development centers here. So I think also in the market, it was a blessing and a curse, but you saw basically more talent because everybody is recruiting expats from abroad into Amsterdam. So that was, I think, good for the larger market, but everybody's also stealing from each other. So we had our moments that that competition was quite intense. It was not easy. But overall, I think Amsterdam and I think Europe is has matured. Of course, it's not at the level of the US or Silicon Valley, but I think it made. I'm very pleased and grateful for the progress we've been able to make.
And at what point did you start considering international expansion? Because today you are serving how many markets?
We are serving around 150 banks, individual banks around the world, and they are pretty much in every continent. So I think in total it's between 50 and 60 different countries. Yeah. I think from day one, we decided with Backbase to be an international company. So although it was founded in the Netherlands, our default language from day one was English, the exposure, the website, and I knew that from the previous experience, you just need to kind of behave like what you want to be called. So you go immediately. Also with Google advertising, we were kind of proclaiming our value proposition on LinkedIn, on Google, etc., just to go out there and do your growth hacking. So for us, especially at the moment you go into banking, that is such a specific market. You basically are targeting around 5,000 institutions. So you can be pretty focused there. And the whole idea is, of course, that you build word of mouth and you have to build reputation. So now from day one, it was international. And basically it meant that we had to kind of get into the plane and do a lot of traveling. And you come in a lot of exciting countries where you think, okay, how is this going to play out? But yeah, if you go for a vertical, I think that goes back to Jeffrey Moore. If you pick your niche market and you put all your energy, your product roadmap, your positioning, everything, you can have a shot to kind of become a real specialist. And that deep expertise, that deep specialization has then moat if you are competing on a global scale. So interestingly enough, we have been very successful in outcompeting local alternatives with an international company.
That's interesting. I guess if you're specialized around financial services, whether you are, I'm going to make up some countries, in Pakistan, Brazil, or the Netherlands, you're speaking the same language, right, with your customers, and it's the language of the industry, financial services. But at the same time, I mean, I'm sure you've built local teams, or you're partnered with local talent. What have you learned about building a global?
Yeah, so I think there's different phases. Like the first phase, you really do everything from headquarters, and we had to do an insane amount of travel. But then you get critical mass, and people say, we actually would like you to be much more closer to us. Ideally, you are in Manila, or you are in Sao Paulo, or like you are in New York, right? So they really want you to be closer. So I think that's kind of about 6-7 years ago. That was really the signal from the install base at the time. Please establish local hubs, especially with your services and your delivery and your customer success organization. Be with us and let's work together. And we basically got advice. We basically just responded to that demand. And I think right now we have around 16 different hubs around the world, where we basically get with the idea of how do we kind of create a local Backbase franchise? How do you enable local people to be entrepreneurial and basically own a book of business? They are responsible for 4, 5, 6, 8 large banks, and that's their book of business. And it's all about how do you build close relationships with the bank? How do you understand the use cases they have and that you actually deliver on those use cases? What kind of scoring does the customer really give you? Like, are you really executing what they are looking for and expecting? It's very safe. It's kind of basic, right? But if you do that well, then you build trust and you can do more together.
Maybe can you share a little bit about the main products you are giving your customers today?
Yeah, the if you think about Backbase, and let's start with the problem. I think the problem with pretty much every bank around the world is that the architecture they have created over the last 50 years is very siloed, and it is basically channel centric. So you've got a bunch of legacy core systems and payment rails, and then they have the branch, the call center, the ATM, internet, mobile, and all these different channels are created pretty much every decade, but they are created in isolation. So it's almost like it's a very bank-centric inside-out model where they say, great, new technology. We've got another channel to push stuff to our customers. So it's like we've got products and how do we push it? And I think the Backbase point of view, because we were coming from that portal world, we say like, hey guys, actually maybe it would make sense to do this and turn it around, to do a paradigm shift. Like why not start with the customer and allow them to pull stuff into a single screen? So I think our UI and our portal heritage basically kind of led us to a point of view where we said, okay, that channel model is completely broken. Why not bring it together? And that that's what Backbase does today at scale, where we say you've got your system of records, then we can decouple the channels with a very loosely coupled integration layer. And then instead of having channels, we're going to kill channels. We're going to crush them. We're going to replace them with an orchestration platform like Uber or like Netflix, just one platform. And in that platform, we can do everything with security, the process orchestration, the payments. It can communicate with all these downstream systems. But then we can actually, from that omni-channel platform, we can service the end customer, the employees, the call center, the branch. So that's kind of how it evolves into what we call now, you've got the system of engagement, system of integration, and then the system of record. So the banks can keep the systems of record. You can hollow them out, but you don't need to replace them. We're not going to do open heart surgery. But where you interact with your customers, that is where you sell to them and where you service them. So it's servicing and selling. That's where you kind of basically need to orchestrate the customer journey. And ideally, you do that on a single platform.
And tell me a little bit about, I kind of know the answer, but tell me a little bit about the systems that you are working with. I think not everyone understands how messy and outdated sometimes this can be.
Yeah, well, I could take many angles, but I think what is really important for any bank, and probably many of the fintech people here in the audience kind of recognize this, if you have to interact with legacy systems, I think exposing those capabilities that you do not want to replace or you're not able to replace, at least expose them via a proper middleware layer, an API gateway. So I think the integration piece is really important, just to make sure that you have bidirectional access to systems of record. So that's kind of how do we preserve these systems of record and how do we kind of get them ready to operate in today's world. Then next to that system of record, you now see with the fintech ecosystem, you see so many powerful capabilities available as fintech as a service. So from KYC to AML to credit card capabilities, fraud detection, and all these capabilities are basically headless, right? So now think of it. We have our legacy capabilities. They are available via APIs. The whole fintech capabilities are available via APIs. That's what we call Grand Central. It's kind of our integrated. It's kind of basically all the rails comes together, and we bring everything together in a standardized API, which is super powerful. So now you can do anything. You can make any meal because you have access to kind of basically any data or any capability. And then what you then do on top of that Grand Central, you have what we call the engagement orchestration platform. So I think most of the system interactions are actually downstream to the fintechs and to the legacy systems, and you basically need to make sure that you've got the rails, so you can compose on top of them, you can do the journey. Once you have those APIs and the integrations in place, I think you can just innovate super fast, but you do that journey centric. Does that make sense? And in that way, you create online banking, mobile banking. We start to replace legacy branch applications, call center applications, like all the legacy siloed. Gradually, you are replacing them. So it's called progressive modernization. You don't have to bite the elephant in one go, right? You slice and dice it. And what we found out is you actually do it journey by journey. And the journey is basically instant value for the end customer, and it is instant value for the bank.
So tell us about kind of the process that at this point I'm sure you've perfected and that you've learned about actually successfully working with banks, right? I'm sure you have to identify some champions. And then, like you said, it's a land of fun thing. You want to go little by little. But working with banks it's something that a lot of fintech entrepreneurs aspire to do, and
Yeah.
also currently something where people make a lot of mistakes.
Yeah, I would say like Backbase certainly has not perfected it. To be clear, I think it's we are in a journey to do it better. I think maybe to share it with the audience. What really proved very important for us is to figure out like, are we really working with people that would like to make change, or do we interact with people that actually are for the status quo? The nature of our product is change, not status quo. So we basically get a lot of political stuff and pushback by people that are for the status quo. And that's just a given. I think also if you are a software or a fintech company, you need to deal with it to a degree. But I think the most positive way to deal with it is actually to kind of create critical mass with change makers, and preferably decision makers that have a change maker mindset. I think that's the best positive advice I can give, because you really need that support at the C-suite and below to drive this change. It's not per se about fintech or about software. I think it's about basically re-architecting the bank and making the bank. So I think it's, especially in the context of Backbase, it is existential for the bank. Like, do I continue to operate in my current operating model with all the legacy and with all the silos? And you basically stay in that legacy trap. And a lot of people are making a living out of that legacy trap, and it's kind of their baby and they're protecting it. Versus, okay, are we going to move to a platform model, which is 10 times more efficient? It is really 10 times more efficient, but it needs to have the strategic leadership to drive that through a transformation model. And sometimes that is great, and sometimes that is also a little bit frustrating for us.
And what have you learned about finding these change makers, right? Because they're not always
No,
the type
well,
on the change.
actually, you will be surprised. You never know, right? From the outside, you will discover that in conversations, etc. But from a demand gen point of view, we are, for instance, having a function in Backbase that look like just kind of change in leadership. You can look at kind of when people, so like you look at these trigger events where people make certain announcements. You see these larger transformation programs being reported in annual reports. So I think with a lot of desk research, you can already identify, like, at least you can get some understanding like what's happening. But ultimately, when we grew up, we're now in a model where we have account management functions where people have target accounts and they really take care of 10 or 20 target accounts that are not on the Backbase platform yet. But you really make sure that you focus on these accounts and you collect as much as possible intel. And that is via public sources, but it's also in the partner ecosystem, because it's critical to understand, like, when is the timing right? Timing is everything. You first need to make sure that there is a change program in the first place, right? And you need to then identify who are the people that are driving it. So it's very labor intense, I can tell you.
Let's switch gears a little bit. Something that kind of we've talked about in the past is how you start a business. Obviously, at that point, revenue is zero.
Yeah.
Then at some point, you get to 10 million, already a big accomplishment.
Yeah.
And at this point, I believe you've crossed 300 million.
We're
right?
about that number. Yes, correct.
Yeah.
Yep.
So not a small business by any means. But your role as a leader of the company, as CEO, is not the same as back when the company was close to zero or 10 or even 100, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
What have you learned about reinventing yourself?
Yeah, I think that's, at least for entrepreneurs here in the audience, what I did is kind of, I basically chopped it in kind of chapters, like writing a book, like probably like 5 years each, or 3, 4, 5 years. And you basically need to ask yourself the question, like every 5 years, like, do I still like it? Can I do this? What is the type of team I need around me? And you go to very pivotal moments in that journey where you have to reinvent yourself or your style, but also you have to make changes to your team. And those changes are very difficult because you've been working with people for 5 years, 8 years, 10 years, and then you're kind of hitting a ceiling together as a group, and you need to kind of move or figure that one out. So those, I think, are the difficult moments, just to figure out, like, per stage, what is the team composition? And especially also with people that have been very loyal, like how does that work? It's difficult. But like ultimately, you'll find your way through that. I think right now, being in the 5th chapter, like we're kind of roughly there. The operating model of the company is completely different. Like the first chapter is like you're in a speedboat and you can go in any direction. And it clearly has evolved into portfolio management, where you work with different commercial teams, you work with different product teams, and you work with a leadership team. So it's kind of a more indirect model where you interact with the different leaders of those teams and you have to conduct and orchestrate. Another thing is maybe kind of more recently, I think at scale to do culture. I think you and I also briefly discussed it, how to figure out like how to preserve or be very explicit about culture at scale, like with 2,000 to 4,000 people. That's just a whole different ballgame.
On that point of culture, there are companies, successful and unsuccessful, who get started and from day zero, they're thinking about culture. It sounds like that wasn't necessarily your case. That came later.
No, I don't. Well, making it explicit came later. I think from day one, we've been living culture, right? You do, because you jump into a plane, you go there, you've got a vision. So today our culture is still like can do. Let's make it happen. Or we always feel like we work in a wolf pack to deliver, make a customer go live, or like that was kind of already from day one our language. So collaborate as one, just getting these things like. But at a given moment, you wake up and you say like, it's really important. We're going to write it down. So, but like you then write down what you think at that moment is what you're doing, right? So I don't think I think it has to be genuine in that sense. And I think there's also elements, I think, of the personalities of the different people that are in that founding team that are quite, I think, instrumental in defining that culture. At a given moment, we had to kind of refine it a little bit more to make these cultural elements, I would say, more behavioral. And what I mean with it is that you can also say like, hey, if you do a review discussion with someone like, hey, this was really can do, or are we really acting here as collaborate as one, or are we telling it the way it is, right, in order to make it better? So I started to learn that you have to be explicit about values, but I think ideally the values are also behaviorally, so people understand what it means for them and how they can work with it.
Do you remember that process or that period of time where you got pulled by maybe someone in your team, or you yourself realized, okay, we need to do this? How was that exercise?
Yeah, it was a cool exercise. I remember. Actually, it's a great question. I remember like we were just in a brainstorm room and we hashed it out probably in 90 minutes. We're just like whiteboarding it, putting it down, and till today they are there. But like more recently, and this is, let's say, this year, we started to realize like maybe we want to refine some of those. We want to make them more behavioral. We also would like to really kind of make sure that we can really use them in how we recruit. Or like very clear intent in culture selection, in what type of people entering Backbase. Very clear in what type of people do we promote and why are we doing that? Next to the professional skill sets, like the Backbase code, the Backbase values, how do we bring that more in balance? So it is actually one of the topics right now in Backbase to basically, we go back to our heritage, we go back to our values, and we are in the process of making it way more explicit. And the reason is we figured out like, if we do this at scale, maybe just one step back, through COVID, the company doubled. So you got a lot of people that are joining the company. And in that period, we were not always that conscious about like, are we truly always selecting on values? And we started to realize like, if you got a large quantity of people and you're not per se solidly explicit about what are your values, then that can be problematic. So we're kind of in a way kind of tuning that or course correcting that a little bit, as in we want to be very deliberate about and explicit. So people can choose to be part of that culture.
You are known for being a straight talker. Do you think that's a requirement for every CEO?
I think every CEO has a style. So I wouldn't say it's a prerequisite. No, I think there are for people that are very diplomatic and very effective. So, no, I'm a big believer is that stay true to who you are and try to work with the assets you have, stretch yourself by learning and experience. But like, I think you have to work with your natural capabilities and tune them.
But being a straight talker in banking is, I'm sure, not the easiest. A lot of
it's not a good trait. No, I'm in that regards. I mean, I've got a lot to learn there. Like, no, you cannot. You have to have a huge level of patience and a huge level of diplomacy in working with clients. So the conversation is more like, hey, guys, what we've seen with other banks, or what we think could really work in your case, but It's kind of recommendations, it's kind of nudges in a certain direction, but like we're not running the bank, right? So they absolutely do that within their own pace and within their own cultural value system. But therefore, I do think like the change makers within these banks are way close to the Backbase value. So we see very good chemistry there. So it's maybe a little bit self-selecting the type of people you work with on the client side, but also with our colleagues. And I think self-selection, at least being clear about where you want to go and what you value, I think that is a powerful thing to do. So it enables people to decide if they like it and if they want to contribute to it.
You started bootstrapping, but then eventually you decided to bring on some investors, right? What changed your mind? How was that process for you?
Yeah, Miguel, the company became a little bit too big. Like we were already kind of approaching 200 million at the time. And we also had we started to move many of our client operations to the cloud. So you have the full responsibility now to run probably one of the most business critical functions that is client facing 24/7. So it's a huge responsibility. So we felt like it would be good actually to fortify our balance sheet just in case something would go wrong. I wouldn't call it a black swan, but you've got a very fortress type of balance sheet. And there's also opportunities to do basically some consolidation in the market. We thought hey, probably a few of these very niche type of very innovative fintechs, they will not kind of operate and get the distribution and sales angle solved themselves, but as part of the Backbase ecosystem, they could really do well. So with those two elements are the rationale to do it.
What have you learned about kind of fundraising? Because when you go out in the market, you meet with a lot of partners to process. How was that for you?
Yeah, you meet all sorts of people. So ultimately, we decided to go with. We were fortunate enough to make a proposition that there was interest in the market. There was very good interest. So that kind of created a position where we basically said we would love to kind of get someone that is kind of closest to subject matter expertise. Of course, everybody's talking about added value, and I think most entrepreneurs here in the call probably will take that with a grain of salt or not. But that doesn't really matter. Personally, I was quite skeptical about the added value, but especially with the motive people who clearly are ex-operators, with Rob from Capco, with Jeff Tabuki from Fiserv, we saw a bunch of people like very senior, very respected business leaders that can genuinely act as a sparring partner and have the credibility not via the spreadsheet or via whatever the exit story, but running and operating these businesses. So that was kind of appealing. And they also have a very large network of people from their previous, let's say, industry experience that bring very deep subject matter expertise. So I'm very grateful that we selected Motive and with a very good relationship.
Yeah, good folks at Motive for sure.
Yeah, so it's kind of also there in a way. It's a vertical private equity in that sense, just like Backbase is a vertical SaaS company. So that's not explaining it completely, but there are definitely more similarities than with a wider private equity approach.
Yeah. Before I let you go, I want to kind of go back a little bit to talking about banks, right? And we talked about how you think more companies maybe not replicate, but they should learn from the Twitter Elon Musk example, right? Yeah. I mean, he took the radical approach, got rid of 80% of the company. The site still runs, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
How can we apply that mentality in banking? Well, what are your thoughts here?
Well, let's set aside what people think from. Sometimes the name Elon Musk kind of gives all sorts of associations for the audience. But I think if we focus on just the positive aspect of what he would do is kind of cut the bullshit, can do, first principle thinking, I really think that's critical. So I think any government, any bank, any organization can learn from being more bold and more brave to do these things. But many people will not execute against it because if you don't have that leadership style, nobody will try it. And there's a lot of forces in place that will protect the status quo. Does that make sense? There's a lot of people that have a vested interest to keep Twitter running like it is. In that particular example, the same with our company, my company, a bank. This is just how these things operate. So I think you have to be very brave. If I look at banking, people will use a lot of arguments. It's not allowed by the regulator. Nobody wants to mess with that. So it's a perfect excuse to never change. Oh, if we touch this system, the bank will collapse. Well, That's truly like, so there's a lot of kind of that anecdotal stuff around it with a lot of, let's say, argumentation and business case development why these things actually should stay the same. If I look what Backbase does, we basically spent 15 years now to build a full stack from how we integrate to the core, to the fintech. Everything is in place. And I think we can run the technology stack of any bank at 10% of the cost. That's a very bold statement, and I'm putting it here in a podcast, but I really think that's possible. You wonder, like, why is it not happening? I think that has to do with change makers and a level of leadership to be bold enough to reimagine every customer journey for the bank. And it's just, I'm grateful to see, by the way, that we have more and more customers that actually do it. So it is totally possible. We have dozens and dozens of cases where people in their own pace, with their own, to be clear, they are absolutely not Elon Musk, but they do it. They do it in their own pace, and it takes them 4 or 5 years, but they really transform. And so I think that kind of gives us a lot of conviction that the business case is there. It's kind of more the mindset and the type of leadership style to embark. Some people just want to retire. It's a career limiting move. They're not interested, and that's fine. That's certainly not a change maker.
Does that mean that you're not just the orchestration layer, you're also helping banks and your clients reduce the number of tech providers, suppliers that they use? Because I know
Absolutely.
banks have thousands.
I think with the Backbase platform, you can replace 400 proprietary systems into one platform. Absolutely. Backbase is about progressive modernization and simplifying of your IT stack. People have dozens and dozens of applications just in the call center. Even in mobile banking, you see all sorts of different horizontal technologies glued together to make mobile banking work. Same with internet banking. I see customers that the backend for mobile is different than from internet banking. The branch is for sure completely antique. Call center is different. Banking is one of the few verticals that are so profitable that apparently it makes sense to keep these systems running. But there's no rationalization for it. You can absolutely do this with ultimately, and I don't want to sound bold, and it needs a lot of strong leadership, and it needs perseverance, and it needs probably 5 years of execution. But you can, and I think that's what you of course see with the Revoluts and with the new banks, and what you will see with all the challengers. They are doing these things typically at a fraction of the cost. So what Backbase is like, we're not going to compete with banks, but we basically build a greenfield technology stack, not a greenfield bank, a neobank, but a greenfield technology stack to basically give the banks an opportunity like, hey, if you want to change and if you have the type of leadership to really transform the bank, here's the thing that can jumpstart you in that transformation. You're spot on. You can massively simplify your IT landscape, massively.
Yeah, I think in every vertical that we look, there's already some fintech companies making big waves and being built so much more efficiently. I mean, one of my recent guests was David Fortunato, the CEO of Wealthfront.
Yeah.
Their revenue per employee is over $1 million
Yeah.
per employee.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. That's, if you look at their kind of analog version, Charles Schwab.
Yeah.
They're nowhere near, even though they're much, much larger.
Miguel, thanks for sharing that example. So sometimes we make the statement like the traditional banking model will not survive. It's not that banks will survive, but the traditional banking model kind of with kind of all that inefficiency, with all that duplication, with all that, they're basically in a legacy trap. And it's legacy technology, but it's also legacy, let's say, process, structure, maybe a little bit legacy culture here and there, but it's a legacy trap. And with progressive leaders, you have the right culture, you have the right ambition, they want to make the change. And then the good thing today, if you wake up, all the cloud capabilities are there. The fintechs are there, the APIs are there, white label platforms like Backbase are there. So I think like maybe 10 years ago, that was not the case. You had to do still a lot of, let's say, I think also that's also where companies like Revolut are built from the ground up. These guys had to do engineering themselves. I think in a parallel track in the last 10 years, companies like Backbase did the same thing, but white label. So if you wake up today, you want to drive change and you want to reduce and simplify your cost structure, it's totally possible.
Before I let you go, books that you find yourself recommending often? Any books that you've enjoyed? I mean, you mentioned Cross.
Yeah, no, Jeffrey Moore, Crossing the Chasm. I'm chatting with him next month. But like, I think that was kind of my, already 20 years ago. I think like, because it's the ultimate book that helps you to kind of find product market fit. Eric Rice, The Lean Startup, I think also super powerful, even for large organizations. So I think these concepts are simple. More recently, I go back to Jim Collins. I remember reading those books, but I couldn't use them because they were for companies of a larger scale. So I remember Good to Great. I was reading it it didn't click, but I was reading it my last summer holiday, and it suddenly started to make a lot of sense. But that correlates with the size of the company. Well, these are all boring business books, guys. So
yeah, you'd be surprised at the audience.
All right. No, but like they are the classics, and I think they're very good classics.
Thank you for doing this. I hope we get a beer when I'm in Amsterdam.
Cool.
Never go there. It's fascinating stuff. Congrats on all the success at Backbase, and I'm sure the audience is going to learn a lot from this.
Great. Thank you, Miguel, and it was great to be here. Thank you.
Thanks for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed this great episode with Jouk, CEO of Backbase. If you want more interviews, make sure to subscribe, follow, and leave a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your shows. It helps and means a lot. And if you have any suggestions or thoughts about the show, just drop me a line on Twitter or LinkedIn. Signing off till next week, I'm your host, Miguel Armaza. The Fintech Leaders podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be considered financial or investment advice.